Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you with us to polish your ability to make wise reserve decisions. Well, let me tell you why I care about a presentation like this. This is the view outside of my bedroom window of the 71-unit condo where I was president. It was probably my second or third meeting as president. We were in my living room. I was hosting the meeting, sitting around my coffee table. And the manager at that time reported that the large living room picture window in one of the units was leaking and needed to be replaced for about, as I recall, about $2,500. And he asked me, so what should I do? And everyone turned and looked at me, waiting for my response. And I didn't know what to do. I wasn't even sure what the question was about. Well, of course, we pay it. But his question had more to do with operating or reserves. But I just did not know what to do. And I still remember that awful feeling. So that's why we're presenting this webinar today, to give you the training you need to minimize or eliminate those situations where you don't know what to do. And that's especially important here in 2021, with so much attention being given to setting aside enough reserves to be able to maintain your facilities, keeping them safe and maximizing property values. So let's get going on the webinar. As Paige said, everyone's muted to keep background noise to a minimum, but you can always ask a question of Will and myself through your Q&A dialog box that looks like the image that you see on screen. I'm going to lay a little more foundation before handing off to Will, and it all starts with knowing that the major expenses related to age and deterioration are big. They're inevitable. And association finances are always going to be tight. There's no doubt about that. So you're always going to be in a pressure situation, racing to stay ahead of deterioration. Deterioration is the enemy, and it is indeed a race. Will's going to cover the advanced material in today's program. So if you feel we've skipped over some basics, you can catch up with some of our other recorded webinars, which you'll find on our website, www.reservestudy.com. So you can go there and on our resources tab, click on webinars. And I recommend our Reserve Study Basics and another one we did recently called Roadmap for Success. Those two will pretty much lay a strong foundation for all the decisions you face during the year, the basic decisions. Understanding your foundational reserve principles plus today's material are all designed to help you avoid that awful feeling of not knowing what to do. And that's because, here we go, and that's because managing or leading an association is indeed complicated. And there's so many decisions you're going to face throughout the year and so many ways you can get it wrong. So let me hand off to Will now, who's going to share some truth, some insights, and some answers to help you avoid problems.
Well, thanks, Robert. And yeah, great to be here with you today and with everybody on the program. Sometimes reserve studies are challenges right from the start. We hear objections like you see on screen on a regular basis. What is it good for? It's just a bunch of guesses. Why pay for something we'll just ignore? Always find that one interesting. Why care at all? I won't be here.
Hey, Will, let me ask one more. Following up on that one, you're from our Florida office. Is that something that you hear commonly there, or is that something we hear all across the country?
I hear that one every single day. Yeah,
okay.
With our percentage of retirees, older demographics, and a lot of associations, that seems to be a very common pushback that we get against reserves and reserve studies.
Okay, got it. Thanks.
Sure. So let's dive right in. A reserve study, first of all, is based on predictions about future events over which we have no control. So it's honestly kind of weird to work in a field where I know with 100% certainty that our reserve study projections will not be exactly true, but it's going to be pretty darn close. Think of it like getting directions on your phone. Okay, well, it may not be perfect. It's a pretty effective tool, and you need your phone. You need help knowing how to get where you want to go. A reserve study also shows you what you need to do to get successfully to the future. A reserve study helps you see the twists and turns on the way, and if it's going to be an easy trip or a hard one. So you need that guide to help you with your decision points. We base our reserve studies on industry standards, actual project history at our association clients and neighboring properties, and the current condition of your property. We're going to help set you up for success. So, like that navigation app on your phone, no one's telling you that you have to follow your reserve study, but it's a great guide that lays out your major upcoming expenses, giving you an opportunity to prepare financially and make informed choices along the way. We're not making guesses about things 20 years in the distant future. We are identifying the current state of deterioration at the property, and with a combination of inflation estimates and regular updates, we're going to make sure you're ready for those expenses.
Can you say that one more time? I think that's something that people miss. They think we're guessing about something far into the future, but indeed, aren't you just looking at the current condition and then knowing how long things last, and with annual updates or regular updates, able to move that projection forward?
Absolutely. Yeah, the reserve study is a current year document. It tells you what's going on today, and that knowledge helps you to make informed decisions about what may come down the line, but it's by no means a once in a lifetime document. This is something that does need to be updated on a regular basis.
Yeah, like the weatherman's not going to make an accurate prediction about something 3 months in advance, but the weatherman
Right.
can make a good prediction about today, tomorrow, and the next day.
You would hope so, yes.
Got it. Okay, thanks.
Okay, so I talked about some industry standards. What I mean are national reserve study standards. Okay, these standards guide our entire industry, helping us to use consistent terminology, calculations that give you standard disclosures, even guiding us as to which components should appear in your reserve study. So the more that your reserve study provider follows those national standards, ideally the more accurate and useful reserve study you're going to get. So let's go through some problems here that you can avoid. First of all, don't make statements you can't support. When it comes to the reserve study, it's much better to say, well, let's look at the study and see what it says, rather than say, oh, the reserves are great. Okay, people can and will misinterpret your well-intended comments. Always go back to the source, the original reserve study you've had done. Secondly, data like you do a banana or an avocado. They're perishable. You've got to update that reserve study regularly to get fresh information. Third up here, delaying projects. While that may sound like a good idea to hang on to that money and not spend it, in most cases, doing the project on time is a good idea. Okay, that keeps the property well maintained and avoids cost overruns that are very typical when you start getting into a habit of deferred maintenance. In addition, it enhances owner enjoyment and the curb appeal that supports strong property values, which we'll come back to later on. Now you want to be careful, okay? Don't spend reserve funds on non-reserve projects. Make sure anything you spend reserves on is either listed as a reserve component or passes the National Reserve Study Standard 4-part test. It may seem like no big deal, but a few hundred or a few $1,000s here or there really does add up over the course of a year, which will prevent you from having as much in reserves as you were planning to. Now, reserves are not a miscellaneous savings fund. It's not a slush fund, okay? If your association is in a cash flow crisis and you need to borrow from reserves, commit to restoring that cash, putting it back in the reserve fund so that you'll have enough money when you do need it for those reserve components. Now, the same is true from the income side. Okay, make sure you've set your budget so you're able to make your scheduled reserve contributions. The funds won't be there when you need them if you never put them in. And finally here, not being careful about or not being casual, I should say, about your reserve investment. Maximize your investment returns. Ladder your funds that are on deposit so that you have enough spendable money when you need it. All right. Now let's keep an eye on the big picture here. What are you trying to accomplish with reserves? Let's keep an eye on the big picture and focus on that big 30,000 foot view. All right. First of all, it's having enough funds on hand to do your scheduled projects in a timely manner when they need to be done. I grew up as an athlete. My son just started playing soccer. Okay, they don't keep score yet, but of course, all the parents know the win-loss record of the team, right? Now in sports, you need to know the rules. You need to know the score. So how do you win at reserves? Well, just like with most games, the score is based on numbers. You have a plan that's based on income and expenses. You need to keep the income coming in and keep your expenses from getting out of hand. And there is actually two sets of rules that affect reserve studies and reserve fund management.
I was just thinking with the numbers, it's almost like the income is our score and the expenses are their score, and you're trying to keep them from getting ahead of you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No question. The first set of rules is pretty straightforward, something that we call the 4 reserve rules. Now, this is really just a statement of the facts. This should be obvious. Expenses, like we all know, will always happen. Okay, there's no avoiding them. The board is responsible to manage the assets of the association. As I mentioned a moment ago, delays often get expensive, so don't delay. Don't get stuck with projects that have somehow become way over budget. And finally, the owners will always get stuck paying the bills. So whether the board saves the owners money or makes things more expensive, doesn't matter. Owners will always get stuck paying the expenses. The other set of rules here we can collectively refer to as the business judgment rule. Okay, so when a board's decisions are challenged, whatever they've done is checked against the 3-part business judgment rule. So with all the decisions you make, large and small, you'll want to make sure you're operating according to this rule. What's interesting is that in hindsight, you can be flat out wrong, but if you can show that you follow the 3 steps of the business judgment rule, you will have a strong defense. So make sure everything you do can be described as being in good faith, meaning you were loyal and responsive to the needs of the association. You operated in the best interests of the association, meaning that you didn't do anything self-serving or wasteful, and you were careful and responsible with association money and with the vendors and suppliers you hired. You have to make sure that you acted prudently, meaning that when you weren't sure what to do, you didn't guess, you reached out for help. That could be your landscaper finding out the recommended number of minutes per station to water your landscaping, talking to your accountant, your attorney, your community manager, your insurance agent, or certainly your reserve study provider. In other words, don't rely on guesswork. You don't need to know it all. Reach out to those folks for their wise counsel. And be careful about describing what you have or are striving to have as adequate reserves. Be careful because since 2018, reserve adequacy is a defined industry term. You can see more of that on our website, but pretty simply it means that your reserve plan shows that you'll have enough cash to do all your reserve projects for at least the next 20 years without reliance on future loans or special assessments. Think of this like a sustainability model for your reserves. Okay, so you may often wonder how you can minimize your reserve contributions. You generally can't change your expenses. Okay, the roof is going to fail no matter how hard you wish it would last longer. You're not going to be able to cut the roof cost in half by wishing it to be half the size that it is. So let's focus on the other side. Okay, the income side, maximizing your interest earnings. Some of our clients do that by shopping around to a different bank, or as we mentioned earlier, laddering their investments so they can sock away the money they don't need now for a longer period of time in order to earn those higher rates. Another very important idea here is to do those projects on time. Okay, I can't tell you how many times a client has delayed a painting or asphalt or roofing project thinking they were saving money by doing so, only to end up spending way more money, sometimes 20 or 50% more, as short as a year or two later. Okay, that's a very easily avoidable mistake. Next idea up is make your reserve contributions. Okay, keep your reserve expenses in check. Associations with a strong reserve fund are just keeping their reserve fund stable. They aren't having to make big contributions because they have just a few years before an expensive project. They've funded reserves to offset ongoing deterioration, everybody paying their fair share, which makes sure that the fund grows on pace.
Will, before we leave this slide, I was thinking, I like that point number 2. You talked a little bit about the numbers. We're trying to follow the income coming in, the expenses going out. And one way the expenses get out of hand is when you have deferred maintenance. And it seems like such a natural human response to want to save money by not spending it, by not painting the trim, by not replacing the carpet. It seems so natural, but quite often that just ends up with the board shooting themselves in the foot, and all of a sudden gives the other team a head start, gives the expenses a head start, and all of a sudden you're way behind.
Sure. Yeah, I was just explaining to a client today that's like driving around with low tire pressure, right? You know, what may start as a fairly simple problem to fix, eventually you start to wear down your tires, and if your tires are not balanced, now you're throwing out the alignment of your car, and you've now led yourself into a whole series of problems that could have been very easily avoided by just doing a little bit of preventive maintenance on your car, which you might think of reserve funding as kind of a form of financial preventive maintenance.
Yeah, I like that. I think that was wise counsel you gave to that client.
Okay. So there are ways to save money on the reserve study preparation. The first is to hire us for the right level of service. Okay, if you've had a reserve study prepared according to those National Reserve Study standards, you probably don't need another full reserve study. You can select between less expensive with site visit or no site visit updates. And you can improve the quality of your reserve study and stretch the interval between those updates by asking questions, right? Making sure the reserve study is custom tuned to your association. Then finally, you want to be involved in the process. When we find a helpful client that answers our questions about what was done and when and why and by whom, it reduces the amount of time we spend, and we'll be able to charge less for those future updates. All right, now, folks out there, you signed up for advanced concepts, so here they are. First, interest and inflation are both real and important. Very important to point out here, they don't cancel each other out, okay? And that's because interest is earned only on the reserve funds you have on deposit, but inflation causes the entire value of all of your reserve components to grow. For instance, you might have $80,000 in your reserve fund earning interest, but you might have $800,000 in total value of your reserve components increasing each year due to inflation. We talked about the danger of delaying a project, and let me emphasize it again here. There really is very little value to delaying a project. The expense is still there. Delaying a project doesn't have a measurable effect on reducing your reserve contributions. Trust me on this, it's just not worth it. Getting all worked up or frustrated about the question of operating or reserves is also not a big deal. Okay, a $5,000 pool heater is just as expensive to the owners, whether it's paid out of the operating budget or out of reserves. We cover that issue in some other webinars, but the bottom line here is that there's no effect on bottom line savings to a homeowner, whether it's paid from their right pocket or their left pocket, here meaning operating or reserves. By all means, think ahead and take advantage of ways to save money by doing projects together. If you need to paint your trim, paint your ironwork at the same time. If you need to seal your asphalt, perhaps paint your red emergency curbs at the same time. And if you're replacing the furniture in your clubhouse, consider replacing the carpet and repainting the walls at the same time. If you can combine projects and save the company time, that should save the association some money. A few clients have voiced some concerns that they don't want to inappropriately influence the process. They want a good reserve study and they don't want to influence the outcome. No worries on that. I've done over 1,000 of these, in fact, quite a bit more than that. I know National Reserve Study standards, and it's our company logo that goes on the cover. We will welcome all your suggestions and insights into what happened and when and why, and we know when to put our filter on and keep our independence. Okay, nobody's going to twist our arm or add any undue influence here. Now let me take a moment to go over best practices with respect to your reserve funding plan. First, it is in your best interest, and you'll have the most success communicating to homeowners if you characterize reserve funding as offsetting ongoing deterioration. Nobody is paying for something 5, 10, or 20 years in the future. All you're doing is offsetting ongoing deterioration. So when the component fails, you've gradually set aside enough funds to pay for the project. All right, reserve funding is not optional. It offsets ongoing deterioration. We all know deterioration never takes a day off. The funding plan we design is custom for your association, steady and smooth, just like what is recommended in National Reserve Study standards. Make sure you update that study regularly so that any funding plan adjustments are small. Okay, and for those associations that need a little bit more help, we can create what we call an exercise plan. Just like most of us can't go out and run a marathon next week, although I've recently completed a triathlon, I actually know I'm not ready to go out and run a full marathon right now. Okay, an exercise plan, funding plan, is a series of increases that will be spread over a few years, maybe 5 years, to gradually get those reserve contributions up where they need to be so that the association is ready for those big expenses. All right, and the last topic that I'll cover before Robert jumps back in to wrap things up is to help you understand some of the nuances of what you're getting in the reserve study. First, how far ahead will we be looking and estimating these component expenses? So the answer is that at least 20 years of projected income and expenses are required by National Reserve Study standards. But the real answer is that we want to capture all the significant, reasonably predictable projects that are in your future. So if you just put on a new roof that has a 40-year design life, we'll include that in your reserve study. There is no 30-year limit, okay? And I mentioned a few times now the importance of updating that reserve study. So what influences your decision about how often to do that? First of all, having prepared over 65,000 reserve studies as a company, we've learned that when we only touch a client's reserve study every 5 years, it's pretty much a rescue mission. So much has changed about component life and costs and the reserve balance that sometimes that update is almost like a brand new reserve study. Okay, the component conditions, the cost, the fund balance, that has very little resemblance to the prior one. But for those of us who hire every 3rd year, that's pretty reasonable. Okay, we often need to make significant adjustments, but it's not nearly as bad as if you wait much longer than that. Now, finally, there's another category, which are the clients that hire us every year. So in almost all of those cases, the reserve studies we update annually are just minor tweaks, minor course corrections. Okay, it's just what the board needs. It's very easy on the owners. The reserve funding plan just never gets far off track, or if it does get off track, it's very easy to bring it back online. Okay, so in addition to my kind of impressions on the subject, let me back that up with some numbers. Okay, the associations that do hire us every 3 years instead of every 5 years have 8.3% fewer special assessments than the 5-year group. And that's simply because they've limited their drifting away from the original plan to just 3 years instead of getting 5 years off course. All right, so let me wrap up my portion of the presentation with this one here. Here's a huge benefit that will help you decide how often to update your reserve study. Those associations that update the reserve study annually have just 35% fewer special assessments than the 1 in 5 years group. Okay, again, that's because they're staying on top of the plan, never letting it drift too far away from them.
Well, Will, you talked right at the beginning about the reserve study incorporating the ideas, the expenses, the possibilities for many years into the future, but it being literally a document that has a 1 year, it's a 1 year perishable document. It's static information that says, this is what your association is like right now. And that's that plan. And as you're updating that plan and rolling that plan forward, it goes from fresh to fresh to fresh to fresh. Is that fair to characterize it that way?
Yeah, it's like going to the doctor every year, right? You wouldn't want to make any health decisions off of a checkup you had from your doctor 5 years ago, right?
Okay.
Now, 3 years ago, maybe that's less risky, but the best way to stay on top of your health, whether it's physical health or financial health, is by taking a regular inventory, finding out what's going on, and making adjustments from there.
Fantastic. Great advice. Well, thank you, Will. And those of you who've heard some of our other webinars have heard us say it's a good idea to update your reserve study annually. And I think you characterized that very well and made that point pretty clear. Now, as we're talking about advanced concepts, I want to talk to you about a new tool we created last year in 2020 to help our clients with their budgeting. Now, historically, our clients received a reserve study as a printed document or a PDF, and now we've made it a live computational tool. Getting the finished reserve study is no longer the end of what we do for you. Now you can actually test changes to your projects on your component list, whether it's a cost or the timing of that project, and you can actually see what happens if you make less contributions than we recommend. It's all there. It's like almost like a flight simulator program. Or you can see how your contributions change when you get maybe a little more interest, as we'll encourage you to do. We think you'll like this tool very much. and we call it UPlanet. And it's an online tool you'll find right next to where you find your completed reserve study information. Right here under Documents, you'll find your completed reserve study information, and UPlanet is just a couple clicks away. And with UPlanet, you can test all your ideas and see for yourself what happens. No more guessing, no more hoping. Will said it earlier, you don't want to base your reserve plan on guesses. You can print out different charts or tables to use in the budget planning process. Now remember, UPlanet doesn't affect the reserve study. It's just a powerful online calculator that allows you to see for yourself what happens when you want to do something different from the plan, when you want to see what happens around this corner, or if you make that kind of adjustment. And the good news is that UPlanet access is free with every association reserves, full with site visit and no site visit reserve study. For all other associations, we have a subscription available for $149 every budget season. And the bottom line is we want you making informed budget decisions, no guesses. And we thought we'd create that special tool that helps you in that budget process, working with that completed reserve study, putting it into action. We want boards and managers to be making responsible and informed choices, testing whatever ideas you want to test with software rather than making assumptions and then just crossing your fingers and hoping for the best. And UPlanet is going to be a big help towards that objective. So let me draw this presentation to a close by making sure you know where to go for more information. First, like I introduced at the beginning of our webinar, we have a deep library of recorded webinars on our website. An advanced tip for everyone today is that the outlines for each webinar with all the Q&A audience interaction for the program are available and are a tremendous resource. Great reading. You learn so much from the questions of others. And those of you who fill out the short survey at the end of this program will be emailed the outline for today's program, which will include a link to a video where I answer all the questions from today's program. And of course, you'll see there's many trade organizations with luncheons and programs pretty much everywhere in the country where you can learn from speakers and others in the audience. And that, again, helps you avoid making mistakes and means that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Someone else has faced that same problem. And finally, if you like this program and would like us to do some in-house training for your multi-site management company, just send us an email. We'll be glad to provide the training you need for your staff to be sharp, effective, and efficient when presenting reserve study information to your client associations. The choices you make do create your future. All those little choices add up and they create the future that you and your owners are going to live in. We don't want you to struggle with not knowing the answers and guessing and kind of feeling your way into the future. We don't want you to make unfortunate choices that are going to lead to disappointment and discouragement and deterioration. And let me leave you with one final idea. We alluded to it earlier. A strong reserve fund is a smart financial move. We did a study back in 2016 that found, to no surprise, that curb appeal is real and measurable. Homes and condo associations with a strong reserve fund sold for 12% more than associations with a weak reserve fund that were comparable. And let me show you that chart right here. Performing timely maintenance does have a real effect on home values. Associations that have the money to do their reserve projects on time enjoy higher property values. That's the big leverage of making those reserve contributions. And I'll include a link to that report in our webinar outline. And for those resources we've mentioned on reserve studies, or for a way to request a proposal for a reserve study update for your association so we can come alongside experienced staff like Will and all of our other project managers, we want to guide your association towards an improved future. Or even if you just want to sign up for our email list, go to our website and that'll get you invitations to future webinars like this. And that again is www.reservestudy.com. And that brings our program to a close. So it's time for me to turn the microphone over to Paige Showerman, who will handle our Q&A time together. Paige, the microphone is all yours.